An Iranian state broadcaster reported it. Nobody in Washington confirmed it. No casualties, no visible damage. That's the actual event sitting underneath this headline. A genuinely uncertain, unconfirmed strike report near a border city most people have never heard of. Let me walk you through what's actually known, because the real context around this specific moment is a lot more interesting than the vague word unreal is doing credit to. I want to start by being completely upfront about what kind of video this is going to be, because it's genuinely different from the usual dramatic breakdown format. This isn't a story where I hand you a confirmed dramatic sequence of events with a clean beginning, middle, and end. This is a story about a single, thin, unverified report and everything surrounding it that actually deserves your attention far more than the report itself does. If you came here expecting a clear, confirmed, unreal event, I want to manage that expectation immediately, rather than stringing you along toward a payoff that the actual facts simply don't support. Former combat fighter pilot here, F-15E, Thunderbird, pilot, years flying commercial jets after that. Let's get into exactly what's confirmed here, piece by piece, because a border strike report deserves the same careful treatment as any other claim in this war, no more and no less. Here's what's actually on record. Iran's state broadcaster IRIB reported that a strike hit an area near Piranshahr, a city in West Azerbaijan province sitting right along the border with Iraq. The broadcaster said it was, quote, reportedly carried out by the United States. There were no immediate reports of casualties or damage. That's it. That's the entire confirmed factual record behind this specific claim as of right now. Sit with that gap for a second. A state broadcaster attributing a strike to the United States is not the same thing as the United States confirming it, and no damage or casualties being reported isn't the same thing as nothing happening either. This sits in exactly the kind of genuine uncertainty that deserves careful handling rather than a dramatic thumbnail. Quick pause here, because Piranshahr specifically is not a random location, and understanding why it keeps showing up in this war changes how you should read this entire story. Follow now if you want the full picture, because this same city has been at the center of a completely different ongoing conflict that most coverage of the main US-Iran war barely mentions. Piranshahr sits in Iran's Kurdish border region, one of several counties, along with Sardasht, Banay, and Marivan, where the IRGC has spent months conducting operations against armed Iranian Kurdish opposition groups based across the border in Iraq's Kurdistan region. That fight has been running in parallel with the broader US-Iran war this entire time, fueled by decades of tension between Tehran and Kurdish nationalist and leftist movements seeking greater autonomy. Reports throughout this year describe real clashes in and around this exact area. IRGC forces using heavy weaponry in operations uncomfortably close to populated areas, with casualties on both sides. Let me actually give you a bit more history on why this specific region has stayed such a persistent flashpoint, because it didn't start with this current war at all. Groups like the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran and the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan have maintained organized opposition to the Iranian government for decades, operating from bases inside Iraq's autonomous Kurdish region, specifically because it offers a degree of distance from direct Iranian government control. The IRGC has treated these groups as a persistent internal security threat for as long as they've existed, well before February of this year, and the broader chaos of the current US-Iran war appears to have created an opening either side views is worth pressing right now, while international attention is focused primarily on the larger conflict. I think it's worth naming directly why this specific overlap matters so much for accuracy. If a strike near Piranshahr actually traces back to the internal IRGC campaign against Kurdish opposition groups rather than the broader US war effort, that's not a minor footnote. It's a completely different story with a completely different set of actors, motivations, and stakes. Attributing every single explosion near Iran's borders automatically to the main US-Iran conflict, simply because that's the bigger, more familiar story getting the most coverage, risks erasing an entirely separate, ongoing human rights and security situation that deserves to be understood and reported on its own terms, not folded indiscriminately into a completely different war. So any strike reported near Piranshahr specifically sits at the intersection of two separate conflicts, not just one. It could be tied to the broader US campaign against Iran's military infrastructure. It could be connected to the ongoing IRGC operation against Kurdish opposition forces. Or, and this is genuinely possible, given how little independent verification exists here, it could be something else entirely that got attributed to the US, simply because that's the most common explanation for any explosion reported anywhere in Iran right now. Let me give you the broader timing context, because it matters enormously for understanding why a report like this one carries real weight even without full confirmation. This strike was reported following what multiple outlets described as a fragile calm that had largely prevailed since the previous Friday, after the latest exchange of US strikes and Iranian retaliatory attacks had finally subsided. In other words, this wasn't reported during an already active, ongoing exchange of strikes. It was reported during a pause, which is exactly the kind of moment where any single incident, confirmed or not, gets outsized attention precisely because everyone's watching closely for the first sign the pause is breaking down again. That's the real story here, not one dramatic, unreal strike, but a fragile calm that may or may not have just cracked with genuinely incomplete information about what actually happened. Let me back up and give you the full arc of how we got to this exact point, because the ceasefire history in this war matters for reading any single incident correctly. President Trump declared a ceasefire over on July 8th after tanker attacks in the Strait of Hormuz that Washington blamed on Tehran. During the escalation that followed, U.S. forces struck military infrastructure, coastal surveillance systems, missile and drone facilities, naval assets, and logistics sites across Iran. Iran responded by targeting what it described as U.S. military facilities and equipment across several Arab countries. All of this happened despite a memorandum of understanding signed back in June that was supposed to end the fighting entirely and launch broader negotiations. That's at least the third or fourth time this exact pattern has repeated in this war. A ceasefire signed, a pause that holds for a while, then a triggering incident, then renewed strikes. This specific Piranshahr report landed right in the middle of yet another one of those fragile pauses. Let me actually walk through that most recent collapse in a bit more detail, because it happened remarkably fast. And it's directly connected to why any single incident right now gets read so anxiously. Just before this reported Piranshahr strike, U.S. forces knocked down an Iranian missile barrage aimed at American troops, working alongside Saudi Arabia's forces to strike sites in Iraq that Iran-backed militias had been using to launch attacks. CENTCOM confirmed every single Iranian missile fired at American forces during that specific exchange was successfully intercepted. Separately, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed it struck and halted 3 oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz around the same window, according to Tasnim news agency, describing them as violating vessels that ignored warnings while sailing what Iran called an unsafe, illegal route. Let me actually put that tanker claim in context too, because it's yet another data point worth weighing with the same careful standard we've applied to everything else in this breakdown. Tasnim news agency, like IRIB, is linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, meaning this specific claim comes from the exact same general category of source as the Piranshahr strike report, an interested party describing its own military's actions in the most favorable possible light. That doesn't make the claim automatically false. Tanker interdictions in the Strait have been genuinely, independently verified multiple times throughout this war. But it does mean the specific framing, violating vessels, unsafe illegal route, reflects Iran's own preferred narrative rather than a neutral description agreed upon by all parties involved. That's the actual immediate backdrop to this Piranshahr report. Not a quiet, resolved conflict interrupted by one strange incident, but a war that had just shattered a brief pause days earlier, with missile interceptions, tanker seizures, and now an unconfirmed border strike all landing within the same tight window. Now, let me give you the numbers behind the human cost of the broader campaign leading into this moment, because unreal as a word deserves to be measured against what's actually verifiable. According to Iran's Ministry of Health, U.S. strikes killed 53 people and injured 592 over roughly a month, from late June through late July, a toll that specifically includes 6 women and 3 children. On the American side, 4 service members have been killed in recent days according to the Pentagon, 3 in an Iranian strike on a Jordanian airbase, and 1 during a controlled demolition of an Iranian drone in Iraq. Nearly 100 additional U.S. service members have been injured this month, most of whom returned to duty. 53, 592, 4, nearly 100. Those are the real, sourced numbers sitting underneath a war that a single vague headline is trying to compress into one dramatic, unconfirmed border incident. I want to sit with the 6 women and 3 children specifically for a second, because it's easy to let a statistic like that pass by inside a longer list of numbers. Those are civilian casualties, reported by Iran's own health ministry, rather than any outside source with an obvious incentive to inflate them for propaganda purposes. Whatever your view of the broader strategic justification for this campaign, that specific detail deserves to be acknowledged plainly, the same way I've tried to acknowledge every other human cost throughout every other breakdown of this war, rather than getting lost inside a larger, more abstract casualty count. Let me give you a detail from this exact same window that I think deserves far more attention than it's gotten, because it's a genuinely significant operational problem hiding behind all these individual strike reports. U.S. officials told CBS News, speaking on condition of anonymity given the sensitivity of the topic, that dwindling stockpiles of defensive interceptors and long-range missiles have become a real pressure point for military and civilian leadership. The concern isn't abstract. Officials specifically said the United States cannot sustain the rate at which it expended precision munitions during the early phase of this campaign while simultaneously needing to maintain readiness to deter other potential adversaries, including China. Think about what that actually means strategically. Every interceptor and precision munition fired at Iran is one less available anywhere else in the world, at a moment when the broader global security environment hasn't paused just because this specific war is happening. That's a genuinely serious constraint that gets almost no attention compared to a single ambiguous border strike report, and I think it deserves to be part of how you understand the overall state of this conflict. Let me actually explain why this specific concern carries so much weight coming from anonymous officials rather than a public statement. Military leadership generally avoids publicly discussing weapons stockpile levels, because doing so hands an adversary genuinely useful intelligence, confirmation of exactly how much pressure continued strikes on your side might actually be able to sustain. The fact that this concern leaked out at all, even anonymously, tells you it's serious enough that people inside the Pentagon felt it needed to be raised, even at the cost of the normal secrecy, around exactly this kind of sensitive readiness information. That's not the sound of a military comfortably managing an open-ended campaign. That's the sound of real internal debate about how much longer the current pace can actually continue. Drop a comment with the word munitions if you want me building out a dedicated breakdown on exactly what that stockpile pressure means for how much longer this specific pace of strikes can actually continue, because I think it's one of the more underexplored threads in this entire war right now. Let me also give you the broader picture of what else was happening in this exact same stretch, because Piranshahr wasn't remotely the only border flashpoint active at the time. Jordan's army reported intercepting a drone that entered its airspace near the border with Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Iraqi local media reported drones targeting Iranian opposition sites around Erbil, the capital of Iraq's Kurdistan region. Israel's military intercepted a separate drone near the Jordanian border, still investigating its origin as of that report. Kuwait's army reported the Abdali border crossing, on its frontier with Iraq, was hit repeatedly by hostile drones, causing damage but no injuries. That's 5 separate border incidents across 4 different countries in roughly the same general window as this Piranshahr report. This war isn't producing one isolated, dramatic border story right now. It's producing a genuinely chaotic pattern of scattered drone and strike incidents across nearly every shared frontier in the region simultaneously. Let me actually walk through why that pattern matters more than any single incident inside it. When border incidents start clustering across multiple countries within the same tight window, that's usually a sign of a broader, coordinated uptick in activity rather than isolated, unrelated events. Whether that coordination comes from Iran directly, from allied militia groups acting somewhat independently, or simply from the natural rhythm of a fragile pause breaking down across an entire interconnected region at once, the practical effect is the same. Every single country sharing a border with this conflict zone is currently dealing with genuine active security incidents, not just the 2 primary combatants. Everyone's attention tends to focus on. I think it's also worth naming how exhausting this must be for the countries caught in the middle of it, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, all absorbing repeated incidents despite not being primary combatants in the core US-Iran dispute themselves. Every one of those governments has to respond to, investigate, and defend against threats that ultimately trace back to a war they didn't start and don't fully control the resolution of, week after week, with no clear end date in sight for any of it. I want to give you one more piece of context that I think reframes this entire story, because it's easy to read a single border strike report in isolation without realizing just how contested the underlying diplomatic situation actually is right now. Iran has reportedly rejected an Omani proposal for joint regional control of the Strait of Hormuz, with a senior Iranian official telling Reuters the plan was, quote, unreasonable. Iran is specifically seeking sole control of the strait's inbound shipping route and partial control of the outbound lane, a position that goes well beyond what any compromise proposal has offered so far. Separately, the U.S. has advised commercial ships to travel closer to Oman's own coastline for safety, while Iran's Revolutionary Guard's Navy has stated publicly it retains full control of the waterway and would respond to what it called unlawful U.S. actions. Let me actually unpack why Oman's specific proposal is worth understanding a bit more, because it shows genuine diplomatic effort happening even in the middle of all this ongoing fighting. A 50-50 joint control arrangement, splitting authority over the strait between Iran and a neutral regional mediator, was a genuinely creative attempt to thread an impossible needle, giving Iran some meaningful stake in how the waterway gets managed without handing it sole, unilateral authority over a passage the entire global economy depends on. Iran, rejecting that specific framework, while still demanding sole control over the inbound route and partial control over the outbound lane, tells you the actual gap between what Iran wants and what any other party has been willing to offer remains genuinely enormous, not a matter of fine-tuning close to an agreement, but a fundamental disagreement over the basic structure of who gets to decide anything about that waterway at all. That's the actual live negotiating context this Piranshahr report is sitting inside of. Not a settled, resolved conflict occasionally interrupted by a stray incident, but an active, ongoing dispute over the single, most contested piece of geography in this entire war, with mediators still actively trying and failing to find language both sides will accept. Let me also mention something happening on the American domestic political side during this exact same window, because it shows this war's costs are being actively debated in Washington too, not just absorbed silently. The Senate again rejected an effort to limit President Trump's war powers regarding this conflict. That's not the first time that specific vote has come up, and it reflects a genuine ongoing disagreement inside American politics about how much authority the executive branch should have to continue this war without additional congressional approval. A debate running in parallel with every single strike we've covered in this entire breakdown. Let me actually explain why that repeated vote matters more than a single procedural footnote. Under the War Powers Framework, Congress retains formal authority to limit or terminate a president's ability to continue military operations without additional authorization, but actually exercising that authority requires enough votes to overcome what's typically strong institutional reluctance to publicly constrain a sitting commander-in-chief during an active conflict. The fact that this specific effort has now come up multiple times and been rejected multiple times tells you there's a persistent, genuine block of lawmakers uncomfortable with how this war has been conducted without additional oversight, even though that block hasn't yet grown large enough to actually change anything. That's a meaningful, ongoing thread running underneath this entire conflict, separate from any individual strike report, and it's worth knowing it exists even while it hasn't yet produced a different outcome. Here's my honest read on why a headline built around this specific Piranshahr report reaches for a word like unreal in the first place. It's a genuinely tempting move when the underlying facts are this thin. A state broadcaster's attribution, no confirmed casualties, no confirmed damage, sitting inside an already chaotic multi-front war. Vague, dramatic language fills exactly the gap where verified detail should be. The honest version of this specific story isn't unreal, it's uncertain, and I think uncertain deserves its own kind of respect, rather than getting dressed up as something more dramatic than what's actually been confirmed. Let me actually walk through the mechanics of how a report this thin turns into a dramatic headline in the first place, because I think it's a genuinely useful pattern to recognize going forward. An Iranian state broadcaster reports an attributed strike. That single, unverified attribution gets picked up and repeated across other outlets, often with the qualifying language, reportedly attributed to, according to Iranian state media, gradually stripped away with each retelling. By the time it reaches a headline built for maximum engagement, what started as a cautious, hedged report from a single interested party has transformed into something that reads like settled, confirmed fact. That's not necessarily anyone deliberately lying at any single step. It's the natural erosion of nuance that happens every time information gets passed along and compressed for a shorter, punchier format, over and over, until almost nothing of the original uncertainty survives the process. I think recognizing that specific erosion pattern is honestly more valuable than memorizing any single fact from this particular story, because you're going to encounter it again in this war and in plenty of others. The original source almost always contains more hedging, more uncertainty, and more nuance than whatever eventually reaches you through 3 or 4 layers of retelling and compression. Let me leave you with the accurate version, stated plainly. A strike was reported near Piranshahr, a border city already at the center of a separate ongoing conflict between the IRGC and Kurdish opposition forces, attributed to the United States by Iranian state media, with no confirmed casualties or damage as of this recording. That report landed during a fragile pause in the broader war, a pause that's already broken down multiple times before across this same 9-month conflict. And it sits inside a much larger picture. 53 Iranian deaths and nearly 600 injuries over the preceding month, 4 American deaths and nearly 100 injuries in the same window, a genuine munitions stockpile concern inside the Pentagon, 5 separate border incidents across 4 countries in the same general stretch, a rejected diplomatic proposal over the Strait of Hormuz, and an active Senate debate over the war's legal authority. Let me actually connect every one of those threads together in one place, because I think seeing them stacked up changes how you read the original headline entirely. A fragile pause holds for a few days, a missile barrage gets intercepted, tankers get seized, drones hit border crossings in 4 separate countries, a Senate vote on war powers fails again, munition stockpiles quietly become a genuine concern inside the Pentagon, a diplomatic proposal over the Strait gets rejected as unreasonable, and somewhere inside all of that, a single unconfirmed strike gets reported near a border city already caught in its own separate internal conflict. That's the actual texture of this war right now, dozens of overlapping, individually significant threads, not one isolated dramatic moment that a 4-word headline could ever fully capture. But that's not one unreal moment. That's a single data point inside an enormous, still unresolved, still actively contested war. And I think it deserves to be understood as exactly that. If this actually helped you see past a vague, dramatic headline into what's genuinely confirmed versus what's still uncertain, share it with someone who's been following this war closely, because I think Piranshahr specifically, sitting at the intersection of two separate conflicts, most coverage treats as one, is exactly the kind of story that rewards actually slowing down instead of accepting the first dramatic framing that comes along. I want to close by being honest about what happens next here, because I genuinely don't know, and I don't think anyone claiming certainty about this specific incident actually does either. If American officials eventually confirm this strike, that tells you something concrete about the campaign's targeting priorities along Iran's western border. If it turns out to be connected to the separate IRGC operation against Kurdish opposition forces instead, that's a genuinely different story entirely, one about Iran's internal conflict rather than the broader US campaign. And if it never gets independently confirmed at all, which has happened to plenty of claims throughout this exact war, that tells you something too about how much unverified information is still circulating even this many months into a conflict this closely covered. Drop a comment with the word Piranshahr if you want me actually following up on this exact report specifically once, or if more verified detail eventually emerges, because I think circling back on individual claims, like this one, rather than just moving on to whatever the next dramatic headline happens to be, is genuinely one of the more useful things a breakdown like this can actually do for you. Let me give you one final thought before we wrap, because I think it ties this entire story together. The single most honest thing I can tell you about this specific report is that I don't fully know what happened near Piranshahr, and neither does most of the coverage repeating it right now. That's not a satisfying way to end a video, and I know it, but I'd rather leave you with an accurate picture of genuine uncertainty than hand you a falsely confident conclusion just because confidence makes for a cleaner story. This entire war has been full of moments exactly like this one, thin, unverified, genuinely uncertain, that either resolve into something confirmed weeks later or quietly disappear without ever getting a real answer. I think the honest thing to do is tell you which category this one currently falls into, rather than pretending it already belongs in the first. Thanks for sticking with a story that stayed honest about what's actually uncertain instead of pretending otherwise. I'll keep tracking this one as real confirmation comes in, and I'll see you in the next one.